beautiful music from Arab countries in Egypt, including Egypt. Gotten here yet, but that's probably my fault because I was so overwhelmed this week. I didn't send out the link until an hour before the meeting, so I apologize. Um, I didn't know if I was going to be able to do it. Turns out my granddaughter instead, and as well as having discovered that she's got a kidney problem that looks like it's not serious, but it could be. She's only 7. On top of it, someone caught COVID, and one of the staff in her school had COVID, so she's back home on quarantine. And I was just with her Tuesday. Then I heard a parent had tested positive from one of her students in her class that she's close to. So we were waiting for the COVID test results. And on top of it, it's my grandson's big birthday party today, 11 years old. So it's been, kind of a chaotic situation. And I didn't know whether I was going to have to go, if I was going to have to go into quarantine or not. So I welcome you all to Zoom Palestine. And today's topic, I think, is something that is very important for all of us. I keep getting a call. Isa, I'm on Zoom Palestine now, doing a Zoom Palestine show. Please don't call me. Yeah, people call me when I'm in the middle of this show. I hope I didn't lose my my Zoom Palestine. So sorry for that disruption. But anyhow, this topic of being attacked for being anti-Semitic, for criticizing Israel affects not only non-Jews, but affects Jews. And it makes a lot of Jews reluctant to criticize Israel because their family and friends may attack them as being what they call self-hating Jews. And this is a big problem. And Israel exploits this sensitivity on the part of Jews to hope that they'll just keep their mouths shut. A lot of my Jewish friends don't like the policies of Israel, but they're really afraid to speak out for fear of what their families or friends will think about them or say about them. So this is a very sensitive and important topic and exploited very successfully by Israel. So this is why we should not shut up. So today I'm going to provide some information on current attempts to shut us up by Israel, some recent ones this week in San Francisco with Zoom. I'm always amazed I'm still able to do these programs on Zoom and Facebook so far. And also, we're going to read about how the EU actually also this week has put in some regulations, branding, expanding the idea of anti-Semitism to include criticism of Israel. Then we're going to hear from some Jews on both sides of the question. We'll hear from people who are very fearful of the rise of anti-Semitism, which we currently can see, which is true. It is rising around the world. Something I predicted years ago, that if Israel continued its policies, that there would be a wave of anti-Semitism coming around the world, and my prediction is true. And also from Jews who feel that that anti-Israel should not be criticized as being anti-Semitic from Jews themselves. And then we'll end with a video which will discuss this whole issue of why criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. So we'll start with the Electronic Intifada is one of my great sources for information on this. And we'll start, having listened to this beautiful Arabian music, we will start with an article on, oh, somebody's coming on. Hi, Edward Brody. Nice to see you. Thank you for joining us. So we will start with this very interesting article from Electronic Intifada on what happened this week. So two interesting things trying to shut us up happened this week. And this is an article of October 6th, just a couple days ago, by Omar Zahza. The caption on the picture says, Zoom holds the power to undercut academic freedom, and did so at San Francisco University, at San Francisco State University. And this is not the first time things have gone poorly for people who are advocates of Palestine and critical of Israel in California. Unfortunately, this is not an unusual situation. So let me see if I can get a view full screen. Okay. All right. So in a predictable show of academic branding, San Francisco State's University claims that having served as, quote, home to the nation's first college of ethnic studies, San Francisco State has a long-standing commitment to inclusiveness and social justice as expressed every day through university programs, initiatives, and services. That's what they say. But it doesn't take much digging to discover this, quote, commitment is disingenuous, particularly when it comes to Palestinians. On the 9th of September, a vice president at San Francisco State University sent an email announcing that the university intended, quote, to address and take action on the campus climate experiences of several affinity and identity groups at SF State, quote, by partnering with SF Hillel International, and the Academic Engagement Network, AEN. The partnership makes clear the university is prioritizing Zionism, Israel's state ideology, and reinforcing the false conflation between Jewishness and Zionism. Hillel poses as an inclusive organization for Jewish students, but is focused on upholding Zionism and combating Palestinian activism. To the extent that progressive Jewish students across college campuses have felt the need to found alternative Jewish community organizations, because the Jewish students don't feel comfortable in Hillel, many of them. By partnering with Hillel, a Zionist national organization, SF State is in fact further marginalizing anti-Zionist Jewish students by limiting its conceptions of anti-Semitism and community empowerment to an issue of the, quote, right, i.e. pro-Israel politics. This is problematic in and of itself, but also concerning is the university's partnership with the AEN, an organization strongly opposed to the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS movement. The AEN, let's go over what those stand for again, the Academic Engagement Network, okay? The AEN was founded in 2015 and headed by former University of California President Mark Yudof. The group claims to support freedom of speech while enforcing repression by constructing BDS and anti-Zionism as anti-Semitic and advising administrators accordingly. This is a familiar tactic for Yudof, who played an active role in drafting and endorsing California House Resolution 35, a non-binding piece of legislation that called on universities to combat what the bill's language termed, quote, anti-Semitic activity, or in fact, Palestine solidarity activism. Furthermore, while Yudof was UC president, his advisory council on campus climate, culture, and inclusion produced a report that similarly urged UC officials to stifle Palestinian activity for allegedly threatening the sense of well-being of Zionist Jewish students. And I remember reading last year an article about a Palestinian student who got expelled actually because his research paper was on what happened in 1948. He was thrown out of his graduate program because he didn't want to change the topic of his paper. He was accused of being anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist. Furthermore, while Yudof was UC president, okay, I'm sorry, I read that. We thus have a familiar pattern in places. Zionist Jewish students are made the default for considering questions of campus climate in order to continue to prioritize a Zionist agenda, while the needs of Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians, LGBTQ students, and students of color, including anti-Zionist Jews of color, are roundly ignored. Naturally, this transcends Mark Yudof alone. But Yudof has carved out a unique position in the crackdown on campus Palestinian activity that continues to have a noticeable influence. Namely, Yudof has honed the tactic of bringing about censorship while claiming to want to protect free speech and academic freedom. This is a very successful tactic that's used very often to shut people up in the pretense of proclaiming freedom, protecting freedom. This is a strategy that continues to be used today to gaslight audiences into believing that the speaker cares about keeping political freedoms intact, while in reality, the words in question are used to delegitimize the activity in question. For instance, University of California, Los Angeles Chancellor Gene Block smeared the 2018 National Students for Justice in Palestine Conference at UCLA in the very op-ed piece where he was supposedly defending students' rights to host the conference in spite of Zionist complaints. Block claimed that some fear that the controversial conference would be infused with anti-Semitic rhetoric. This delegitimizing defense against Palestinian activism on campuses, used by figures like Yudof and Block, demonizes even as it utilizes language, ostensibly attesting to the opposite. It serves to re-marginalize some of the most vulnerable communities on campus, while preserving Zionist Jews as the default community whose need must be centered above all others in a cynical, artificial show of political theater. Canceling Arabs and Muslims. This is a very interesting piece of information in case you didn't know about this. Why is San Francisco State partnering with Zionists and avowedly anti-BDS organizations that actively reproduce the racist and Islamophobic trope of Palestine research and organizing being inherently anti-Semitic? And what are Palestinian, Arab, and or Muslim students to make of the fact that the university is proudly declaring these racist and exclusionary partnerships as it continues to eviscerate the only program that was created to house their experiences and narratives? The AMED, the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diasporas Study Program, was founded in 2006. Led by Rabab Abdul Hadi, the program was, according to its contractual commitments made by SFSU at Abdul Hadi's hiring, supposed to have been grown with new permanent faculty hire lines. To this day, though, Abdul Hadi remains the only full-time professor in AMED, as the years that followed the program's founding saw the university accede to Zionist organizations' agenda by actively undermining and bureaucratically sabotaging the AMED studies program. On September 23rd, Zoom outrageously canceled an AMED open classroom co-organized by SFU faculty members Abdul Hadi and Tomomi Kinukawa that featured Palestinian feminist and liberation icon Laila Khalid in conversation with other paragons of resistance, such as Rani Kasrils, Ula Abu Dahu, Sekou Odinga, and Laura Whitehorn. I remember reading about this and being absolutely outraged at what Zoom did. Zoom's cancellation due to pressure from Zionists and an app aligned with the Israeli government. Again, the Israeli spyware being able to catch all these things, the topic we discussed previously, effectively meant that the classroom was shut down. And other big tech platforms followed suit by similarly blocking the event. At times, liberal reframing of this event glorifies SFSU President Lynn Mahoney. The Foundation for Individual Rights in Education headline claims Mahoney gets it right for supposedly opposing Zoom's censorship of the classroom. But in fact, Mahoney's initial comments threw Abdul Hadi and Kinukawa under the bus by embracing the Zionist talking point of a link between the open classroom and support for terrorism. As Mahoney said at the time, let me say equally, emphatically, that we support the right of our faculty to academic freedom and to conducting their teaching and scholarship without censorship. And I say this while also condemning the glorification of and use of terrorism and violence, particularly against unarmed citizens. Once more, we can see the, quote, delegitimizing defense, unquote, at work by claiming to support academic freedom, but also falsely vilifying the true nature of the event. Mahoney can project an image of being the bigger person and doing everything within her power to support Abdul Hadi and Kinukawa, while in reality legitimizing the Zionist narrative. Big tech's dangerous power. And neither Mahoney nor the university at large ever provided Abdul Hadi and Kinukawa with an alternative platform to host the classroom. Mahoney explicitly deferred to Zoom's, quote, right as a private company to decide its own accord as a non-academic company what is and what isn't sufficiently academic to warrant being featured as a class on its own platform. Lost in all this conversation is the inescapable reality that Zoom has come to wield a comfortable monopoly upon academic programming. If a university contracts with Zoom and Zoom refuses to host a class, that class will be effectively erased unless the university takes appropriate measures to provide alternative boosting mechanisms. And I can speak from experience that my program ZoomPalestine, which was begun as an academic endeavor to supplement my teaching of issues of the Middle East in art and society, that my school, NYIT, took away my Zoom programming. Actually, they took away my entire website and erased me as faculty, but I came back, but I have not been given a teaching job since that event, although I'm still listed as on faculty, part-time faculty, having been full-time and department chair. So I speak from experience with the power that Zoom has. The notion that the university can simply wash its hands of a big tech censorship of its faculty may be par for the course in the neoliberal logic of the corporate academy, but it highlights flagging university dedication to academic freedom social justice, particularly in this case, when the material in question is about gender justice and anti-colonial liberation, or really anything beside profits. 2 sets of grievance hearings have been scheduled via Zoom, ironically, to address San Francisco State University's abysmal track record of authentic support for academic freedom and meeting its contractual obligations to institutionalize a cutting-edge critical ethnic study program that prominently foregrounds Palestine as one crucial component of what Rahab Abdul-Hadi calls, quote, the indivisibility of justice. The first, which took place on the 30th of September, a few weeks ago, focused on the university's failure to uphold academic freedom of Abdul-Hadi and Kinukawa by refusing to host the open classroom in light of Zoom's cancellation. Despite the fact that the hearing was supposed to be public, SFSU's administration delayed online entry for some attempting to listen to developments. Sanghia Kill, chair of the California Faculty Association's Anti-Racism and Social Justice Transformation Committee at San Jose State University, acted as Abdul-Hadi's representative for the proceedings. She told me, this should be like any public event on campus that's open. Instead, she said, the university asked some would-be attendees for their names and university affiliations and delayed entry. Gill added, my demand to have these errors on the record helped to correct the problems mid-hearing, but how many people were denied? I don't know. The second grievance hearing coming up, and we'll follow it up here on October 19th, will address over a decade of attacks on Abdul-Hadi and the Ahmed Studies program that have been perpetrated and upheld by SFSU. Hopefully, the outcome of these grievance hearings will be in favor of meaningful restitution on the part of the university. Of course, SFSU is not alone. This is going on all over the country, all over the world, actually. This week, a professor at Brighton, Bristol University, David Miller, was fired because of so-called anti-Semitism. SFSU's administration can continue to violate the rights of Abdul-Hadi and Kinukawa and Untakat Ahmed while misrepresenting its work with Zionist institutions as authentic community uplift because of the nationwide normalization of anti-Palestinian racism and university campuses. And I would edit that to be the global normalization, not just in this nation. It's time we take power back into our hands and mobilize in support of Ahmed's studies, Abdul-Hadi and Kinukawa, against the institutionalized anti-Palestinian racism and repression across the country. As I mentioned, that this is not just a one school situation. Now, why is this going on? Here's a short article. I'm not going to read the whole thing. But here's an article on the fear that Jews have about anti-Semitism, which is true. It is rising. And here's an article from the, what is this from? It's from a Jewish publication. I can't see the name. It's Unpacked. It's a website called Unpacked that deals with Jewish issues. And it says, no, it's not you, Jew hatred is rising. And the ADL and the current spread of anti-Semitism comes at a moment of historically high anti-Semitic incidents, and when Jews worldwide are vulnerable to being scapegoated by those criticizing the Israeli government. So again, we have this conflation between Israel, the policies of Israel, and Jews around the world. And all Jews around the world do not support what's going on in Israel, but they get blamed for it, much of which is because a lot of them are not standing up for Palestinian rights in Israel, though many Jews are, and there are many Jewish organizations that abound around the world, as well as in Israel, who are critical of the treatment of the Palestinians. And so he says it's a topic we're all talking about and not wanting to talk about at the same time. The incredible rise of anti-Semitism. Now, here we go. Since the start of Israel's latest conflict with Hamas militants in the Gaza Strip several days ago. So again, here you've got the conflation of Israel's policies with anti-Semitism. For many of us, we feel gaslighted at times. We see one narrative in the media and not nuanced reporting we would expect from other topics. One example comes to mind in the New York Times article on a pro-Palestinian rallies taken across the world. Now, so they talk about the coverage of pro-Palestinian rallies as being basically anti-Semitic. They're anti-Israel, but they're not anti-Semitic. Now, they acknowledge that criticism of Israel doesn't always equal anti-Semitism, but the intensified conflict is being used to spread anti-Semitism. And that's probably true. Anti-Semitism always lurks beneath the surface in Western culture from ancient times. And it is true that the criticism of Israel that goes on during conflicts does stir up genuine anti-Semitism, but that's not necessarily the major issue for people. Most people are just mad about what Israel is doing. For example, here they report that city Jews in Toronto were warned that lynch mobs were looking for people who were Jewish. I'm not sure if that's true, but maybe it is. There are reports from Toronto, Montreal, Edmonton of anti-Israel protesters entering Jewish neighborhoods and aggressively harassing residents and vandalizing Jewish property. These incidents include anti-Israel activists shouting at Jewish residents, waving Palestinian flags, and yelling slogans such as "Death to Israel." And several instances now, "Death to Israel" doesn't necessarily mean death to all Jews. So we have, a serious situation here that the policy of Israel are really, here's in Boca Raton, Florida, a van flew around with words "Hitler is right." In Tucson, rocks were thrown out the window of synagogue, a Persian synagogue in Illinois. Cars with shouting "F the Jews." The Jews rape their daughters. So this is a big problem that Israel is actually the policies of what people are getting it wrong. It's the policies of Israel that are causing all of this anti-Semitism. So actually, Israel, the government of Israel and Israeli policies are the biggest anti-Semitic factor in the world, because it's their policies that are creating this anti-Semitism. Because people don't get it in their heads that what Jews in America are different and distinct. They're living in America for a reason. They didn't move to Israel. They don't want to live in Israel. They support Israel because they feel guilty that they didn't move there. But they don't want to go to Israel. They don't like Israel. They don't like the policies of Israel. And people can't seem to get that distinction in their mind. And then we have the EU unveiling a blueprint for muzzling Israel's critics, pretending opponents of Israel racism are being treated as anti-Semites by the European Union. Pretending to fight bigotry against Jews, EU officials this week published a plan for censoring expressions of solidarity with Palestinians. The strategy calls for combating anti-Semitism, as the plan was named, quickly run praise from pro-Israel lobby groups. So the plan was nominally the work of the European Commission EU executive. And they wrote, one pledges that the Commission will help establish a network of trusted flaggers and Jewish organizations to fight online anti-Semitism. EU governments, meanwhile, are encouraged to give police and judicial authorities greater power and resources so they can persecute hate speech on the internet. These proposals resemble recommendations made by pro-Israel groups in at least 3 policy papers issued over the years. The only real difference is that some commitments made by the EU officials are actually bolder and more explicit than what the lobby groups pressed for in those papers. While many of the steps advocated in this plan may look laudable on the surface, they cannot be divorced from how the EU has long allowed Israel and its supporters to set the agenda on anti-Semitism. If recent experience is anything to go by, the Jewish organizations joining the network for internet monitoring will not include Jews who speak out for Palestinian rights. The European Commission barred Jews unwilling to act as apologists for Israel from a working group that prepared the new plan. The plan relies heavily on the definition of anti-Semitism approved by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. That definition conflates speaking the truth about Israel's racism with hostility towards Jews. And Margaret Shininas, a European Commission vice president, alleged this week that anti-Semitism can often hide behind anti-Zionism. So again, we have the EU enacting a strategy to actually enact Zionist policies and prejudices. And I wanted to show you this one article, which maybe I can't find it. I don't know what I did with it. I had a video from a group, somehow it seems to have disappeared, of a Jewish group talking about how anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. But anyhow, meanwhile, I have a video that I'm going to share with you now to end our session on why anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, and we should not be afraid, and we should not shut up.
Now more than ever, Israel's crimes against Palestinians are center stage, laid bare for the world to see.
Thank God for social media, because it appears to me that the world is finally waking up.
To shut down the growing Palestine solidarity movement and silence opposition to Zionism, Israel and its supporters are leaning even more heavily on a tactic they've been using for years.
Growing reports of anti-Semitic attacks and slurs calling out anti-Semitism.
I'm terrified to wear this outside.
First of all, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. But you'll be surprised to find out that quite a few countries claim that criticizing Israel's state ideology, Zionism, is a form of anti-Jewish bigotry.
L'antisionisme est une des formes modernes de l'antisémitisme.
They've adopted this position by endorsing and implementing something called the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism.
Anthony Blinken enthusiastically embracing the IHRA's working definition.
The IHRA definition of anti-Semitism says it is anti-Semitic.
The issue, really, is the working examples, which inevitably.
Before we get to the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, let's go over a key word. Despite what its supporters would have you believe, Zionism is not some feel-good personal identity that many people in Western countries embrace as a form of self-expression.
I am Mexican, I am Jewish, and I am damn proud to be a Zionist.
I am a proud Zionist. I'm not going to stop saying it.
The Zionist cause have built a safe home for Jews like us.
One anti-Zionist Jewish activist put it perfectly when they said, "What terrifies Zionists is the thought that anyone can unlearn Zionism at any time, that it is not an identity, but an ideology, a settler colonial ideology that goes way back." The Zionist movement began in Europe, where Jews had been facing persecution for centuries. The first Zionists were actually fundamentalist anti-Semitic Protestants who wanted Jews to leave Europe. Politicians then picked up the ideology. Zionism was rejected by the vast majority of Jewish leaders, especially rabbis.
What galled anti-Zionist Jews the most, however, was that Zionism also shared the solution to the Jewish question, and that anti-Semites had always advocated, namely, the expulsion of Jews from Europe.
But in the 19th century, Theodor Herzl, a Jewish journalist and activist from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, adopted the idea.
Theodor Herzl.
He wrote The Jewish State in 1896, where he laid down a colonialist, secular, and nationalistic vision for a Jewish homeland. In the book, he weighs the movement's option colonization. He considers Argentina because of the land's fertility, size, climate, and sparse population. And he considers Palestine because its religious significance, quote, would attract our people with a force of marvelous potency. The movement ended up settling on Palestine and announced the decision at the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, 1897.
Palestine.
So the colonization of Palestine by European Jews began. Of course, no one consulted the Palestinians. At that time, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire and had been for over 350 years. In 1917 came the Balfour Declaration. It's a letter from the British Foreign Secretary Lord Arthur Balfour to the Zionist movement, which promised British support for the Jewish colonization of Palestine. What's notable is that Balfour had long been an anti-Semite who had banned the emigration of Jews fleeing Russian pogroms into Britain. His support for Zionism was a fulfillment of Theodor Herzl's own prediction that, quote, the anti-Semites will become our most dependable friends. Soon after the Balfour Declaration, Britain occupied Palestine. At the start of the British Mandate, Jews made up about 8% of the population. This included Jews who had long lived in Palestine and who were not Zionists. And yet, over the coming years, the British would give Jewish settlers disproportionate political representation and would allow them to build up their own militias.
Every colony has its watchtower, its system of defenses, and its organized body of soldier farmers.
Palestinians began joining revolutionary groups and protesting Jewish colonization in Palestine, culminating in two major uprisings in 1929 and 1936, both of which were violently quashed by the British, and in some cases, Zionist paramilitary forces. And while all this was happening, an organization called the Jewish National Fund,
the land of the Jewish National Fund,
was creating a database with information on every Palestinian village and city, information that would be necessary during the next phase of ethnic cleansing.
A turning point in history for the people of Palestine, the promised land.
Between 1947 and 1948, leaders of the Zionist movement executed a carefully prepared plan to force most of the Palestinian population out of their homes. Palestinians call this the Nakba, or the catastrophe. Ultimately, nearly 800,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled for their lives from over 500 cities, towns, and villages across Palestine. In carrying out this plan, Zionist militias perpetrated numerous massacres and atrocities. One such massacre was at Deir Yassin.
The legend becomes a living reality.
The militias involved in the Nakba would come to form Israel's army, and many militia leaders would become presidents, prime ministers, and war heroes. Today, many Israelis deny the Nakba, and the Israeli state tries to erase and obscure this history. For example, Israeli school textbooks described the Deir Yassin massacre as a, quote, miracle and as having solved a horrifying demographic problem. That's how Palestinians are still seen, as a demographic threat. That's why the ethnic cleansing hasn't stopped since 1948, and why so many Palestinians say the Nakba has never ended. For more than 7 decades, Israel has been bringing in settlers from around the world and telling them that they were, quote, coming home, while kicking Palestinians out of the homes they have lived in for generations. Today, Palestinians are divided into 3 major groups. Millions live as refugees and exiles outside Palestine, forbidden from returning by Israel just because they aren't Jews. Those Palestinians and their descendants who managed to stay in what became Israel, about 1.5 million, live as second-class citizens at best, their lives hampered by violent repression and dozens of racist laws that favor Jews. Then there are millions of Palestinians living under Israeli military occupation and siege in the West Bank and Gaza, which Israel occupied along with Syria's Golan Heights in 1967.
The occupation itself is not oppressive, as long as there is no resistance.
For decades in the occupied West Bank, Israel's army and settlers have been burning farms, expanding settlements, building walls and checkpoints, arresting children, and executing Palestinians who try to resist, and even those who don't. In Gaza, Israel is besieging what is effectively the world's largest open-air prison, where half the population are children. Israel has counted their calories, controls their electricity and water, and bombs mercilessly every few years. Or what Israeli leaders have called mowing the lawn. This is at the heart of what Zionism, Israel's state ideology, is. It necessitates erasing Palestinians and pushing them out of their homeland simply for not being Jewish. And that's happening under every single Israeli government, whether it labels itself left-wing or right-wing or centrist. And this is the reaction that we get from Israel's allies.
We fully support Israel's legitimate right to defend itself.
We call on all parties to end the violence.
What we want to see is a two-state solution.
It's not surprising. Western powers finance, trade with, and arm Israel. But these governments also share deep ideological ties of white supremacy, settler colonialism, and Western imperialism. Let's go back to Herzl for a second. He said he pitched the idea of a Jewish homeland to Britain because, quote, the idea of Zionism, which is a colonial idea, should be easily and quickly understood in England. It's in Palestine, Herzl says, that, quote, we should there form a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. So it's no surprise that Israel enjoys the moral and material support of France and the UK, the countries that carved up and colonized the Middle East after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Israel is also supported by the USA, Canada, and Australia, which are all settler colonies also founded on the genocide and expulsion of indigenous peoples. And Israel is supported by European anti-Semitic far-right leaders, just as Herzl had anticipated. Zionism is a colonial ideology with a material history and bodies in its wake. It is violence, it is policy, it is law, it is impunity. Rejecting all that is what anti-Zionism is. And that's why the idea that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic is so ridiculous. It might be more understandable if Zionism was an inherent part of being Jewish, but it's not.
You have a tradition that is older, that is bigger, that is more beautiful than colonialism, a tradition that is older than Zionism.
Today, many Jewish people are anti-Zionists. And not all Zionists are Jewish.
I am a Zionist. You don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist.
In fact, even today, evangelical Christians make up the biggest base of support for Israel in the U.S.
Christians United for Israel, the largest pro-Israel organization in the United States.
They believe that the establishment of a Jewish state will bring about the end times.
Participate in God's biblical mandate.
So why do some claim that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism? Because it's a convenient way to deflect criticism of Israel's brutality against Palestinians.
If we want to win, we have to change our ways. We have to think differently. And this is waging a holistic campaign against the other side. Take him out of his comfort zone. Make him be on the defensive.
Putting Palestinian solidarity activists on the defensive is exactly what the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism aims to do. The definition was released in 2016. The core definition it offers is vague, but it's the examples of anti-Semitism underneath which are problematic. 7 out of the 11 examples mention Israel by name. One example says, quote, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, e.g., by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor, is an example of anti-Semitism. Let's address the Zionist myths being pushed here. The first being that the Jewish people have a right to self-determination, more commonly known as
Israel's right to exist.
Firstly, a state doesn't have rights. People have rights. And asking a Palestinian whose life is dictated by a state that occupies their land and dispossesses them, whether they believe Israel has a right to exist, is like asking a Native American whether the US has a right to exist. The question is absurd. More importantly, if Israel's right to exist comes at the cost of Palestinian ethnic cleansing, expulsion, and occupation, then it most certainly does not have a right to exist. As for Israel being a racist endeavor,
it's official. Israel is a state exclusively for Jews.
Israel's committing crimes of apartheid and persecution in the occupied Palestinian territories.
So yes, an ethno-state built on the ethnic cleansing of a native population, enacting apartheid and occupying their land is a racist endeavor. And that would be the case whether or not the occupiers were Jewish. The IHRA offers a few other problematic examples of anti-Semitism, like applying double standards by requiring of Israel a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. Well, an apartheid regime is not a democracy. And if anything, Israel is not held to any standards. Despite countless UN resolutions and human rights organizations accusing Israel of apartheid, illegal occupation, and settlement expansion, Israel has still not been sanctioned. So we can agree that this is a bad definition. And it's not just us who think so.
It's, as far as I can see, an attempt to stop people supporting the Palestinians.
It's written in a way to be weaponized, to be used against human rights advocacy.
So who wrote the definition? And why are so many countries adopting it? It was first drafted between 2004 and 2005 by 2 pro-Israel lobby groups. They're definitely not apolitical Jewish organizations. The definition was initially drafted for, quote, European data collectors to have a guideline for what to include and what to exclude in reports on anti-Semitism. That's according to one of the definition's main authors, Kenneth Stern. He's now one of its biggest opponents. He says that imposing it on college campuses would threaten academic freedom and that it would hurt pro-Israel activists, quote, because they will be seen as trying to suppress speech with which they disagree. Most importantly, he's against it because it might make it hard for racists who want to discriminate against Palestinians to express themselves. I'm not kidding. He says, quote, consider what speech might run afoul of an official definition of anti-Palestinian. Perhaps when a student says that he does not believe Palestinians have a right to a country of their own and that the West Bank instead should be part of a greater Israel. Despite the opposition, the IHRA definition was enthusiastically adopted by more than 20 countries, including the US, the UK, Canada, France, and Germany, as well as the EU and the UN's Secretary General. The definition is also being pushed onto universities and organizations. The adoption of the definition isn't meaningless. It has real effects on the lives of Palestine solidarity activists in every one of these countries, countries that play big roles in maintaining Israel's occupation of Palestine. Here are just a few examples of the definition in action. The UK was the first country to adopt the definition in 2016. Since then, charity events have been canceled. Israeli apartheid weeks have been banned. Activists and student leaders slandered. And a member of parliament has been forced to resign. Germany adopted the definition in 2017. And 2 years later,
Germany is the first country in the European Union to declare that the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions Movement, or BDS, is anti-Semitic.
Yes, yes, BDS! Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine!
The definition is used as a pretext to cancel events and silence activists.
You have to recognize Israel's right to exist if you want to criticize Israel.
The US is a particularly interesting case.
In just a few moments, I'll sign an executive order to combat anti-Semitism.
It officially joined the club in 2019. A year before that, though, in 2018, the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights quietly adopted the definition. The Office for Civil Rights is responsible for investigating claims of discrimination at schools and universities. That includes claims of anti-Semitism. The man behind the decision to adopt the definition was Kenneth Marcus,
Assistant Secretary of Education for Civil Rights.
Before working at the Office for Civil Rights, Marcus founded and worked at the Brandeis Center, an Israel lobby group that had been using civil rights laws to stifle pro-Palestine activity on college campuses for years, way before there was an IHRA definition to adopt. Here I am debating him about it back in 2013.
Is political involvement in BDS in itself anti-Semitic in your view?
I don't think that movement per se is anti-Semitic. However, there are certainly many different BDS activities where we see people expressing anti-Semitic views in the course of being active in the BDS movement.
People like Mr. Marcus and groups that are aligned with the Israeli government and Israeli policy have been on a crusade to conflate criticism of Israeli policies with this definition of anti-Semitism that has nothing to do with bigotry against Jews. 5 years after this conversation, Al Jazeera's The Lobby came out. An undercover reporter embedded himself in the Israel lobby in the US. The reporter caught Marcus giving his honest opinion on the BDS movement.
You have to show that they're racist hate groups and that they are using intimidation to get funded and to consistently portray them that way.
During his appointment at the Office for Civil Rights, Marcus inspired Israel lobby groups to file several complaints to the US government. He also overlooked more than 400 other open appeals, including nearly 80 that had been pending for more than 10 years, in order to prioritize a complaint from the Zionist Organization of America against Rutgers University. Palestine legal and other civil rights organizations demanded Marcus be investigated for violating federal law, and he resigned soon after. The definition is still in place and has helped Zionist organizations launch dozens of complaints. Even though all the complaints have ultimately been thrown out, they tie up time and resources and chill speech. But despite all the attacks, students, student governments, colleges, and local governments continue to fight back against the definition. Because accusations of anti-Semitism aren't new to Palestine solidarity activists. They're just the latest tool in a decades-old toolbox. During and after Israel's latest assault on Gaza, we saw more and more people calling Zionism out as a racist settler colonial ideology. Unsurprisingly, what followed was a manufactured anti-Semitism crisis.
Dangerous and drastic surge. That's what the Anti-Defamation League is saying about reports of anti-Semitism reference the fighting between Israel and. In the U.S., nearly 200 anti-Semitic incident complaints in the week after the conflict started.
A quick scan of the database mentioned shows that a lot of these, quote, incidents are people carrying signs that read Zionism equals racism or Free Palestine.
In New York's Times Square, a 29-year-old man wearing a yarmulke was punched, kicked, and pepper sprayed during an incident.
As journalist Max Blumenthal points out, the man wasn't wearing a visible yarmulke. It was a hoodie. There was no way of knowing that the man was Jewish.
The witness testimony corroborated the witness testimony I saw buried in media reports of the incident, which was that pro-Israel demonstrators on their way to a pro-Israel demonstration actually attacked the Palestinian young men on their way to a Palestine solidarity demonstration. So you basically have a story that's 180 degrees different than the official version of events, which was conveyed to the American public about Jews just being beaten down. And it really creates the perception among at least some sector of Jewish Americans that they're under siege and that they need an Israel to protect them.
And that's a very important point. As a settler colony, Israel needs two things to continue to survive: support, both material and immigration. Israel can secure both these things by stoking fears of anti-Semitism abroad.
The flight has just arrived. This is going to be exciting. All right, so you guys just got off the plane. Where are you coming?
Zionist lobbies push the idea that what's happening in Palestine is too complicated for the ordinary person to really understand. But in reality, it's really simple. It's a fight against settler colonialism.
هنا باقون غصبا عن روسكم.
The reality is that the fight against apartheid and occupation is intrinsically connected to the fight against anti-Semitism, as well as the fights against Islamophobia and all other kinds of racism.
If you are outraged by cynical attempts to weaponize incidences of anti-Semitism, to smear Palestinians and dismantle the movement for Palestinian liberation and advance Islamophobia, please say, we refuse.
So when it comes to standing in solidarity with Palestinians, take note of who's asking you to speak up and who is asking you to shut up.
Well, welcome, Sheikh Farouj on Facebook Live. I'm glad we got to see the end of this wonderful video. Wow, what a great video, Ed. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Edward Brody is on us on Zoom. So we will stop our share and
now for the world.
And we'll end our Zoom Palestine. And I'm very grateful, Ed, that you stuck it out, and Sheikh Farouche on Facebook stuck it out. I think that's one of the best videos about the whole situation. It really went into both the history and the current situation in a very powerful way, especially describing the current situation of the definition, this new definition of anti-Semitism. So, Edward, thank you again for coming on. Hopefully I'll see you all next week. Anybody? Okay, thank you, Ed, for saying it was well done. Thank you very much. So I'm going to make a video of this and post it on YouTube, so people who couldn't see this. But I think this is a very important video for people to see as part of our program today. Thank you. And now I'm headed to Brooklyn, Ed, your neck of the woods, my grandson's birthday party, and hopefully my granddaughter will test free of COVID and come out of quarantine and I can give her a hug. So God bless everybody, and I'll see you next Saturday. Take care. Masalama. Shukran.